Hi, I'm Sam Harris, author of Letter to a Christian Nation and The Moral Landscape and the End of Faith. And I'm answering questions for Reddit. This is an Ask Sam Harris Anything hour. And I want to thank my friend Jason Calacanis at Mahalo for letting me use his studio. Incredibly nice of him to do that. So I'm just going to jump right into question number one from Cyranor. I've read all your books, I've seen most of your lectures, and I'm a huge fan. Thank you, Cyranor. And my question is, what should we do next? I feel like I'm adrift in a sea of rationality, no clear goal in sight. What do you think the practical goals are for a passionate pro-reason activist, especially those still in college? Well, this is a question I get all the time. It's rather inconvenient that I don't have a good answer for it. I actually don't think there is a good answer for this question. I don't think there's a single programmatic step to take. I think, obviously, atheist groups and conferences and literature are useful, but I think they're useful only up to a point, because you have to think about what the goal is, the end goal. I think we have to get to a time in which people are embarrassed to pretend to know things they don't know. That to me is the center of the bullseye, and that covers religion, that covers any form of irrationality or dogmatism, really. I think the goal is to get to a time where people's bullshit detectors are really finely calibrated, and where we, in public discourse, in journalism, at the level of newspaper editorials and every conversation that matters, we are reluctant to give people a pass when they pretend to know things they don't know. Now the question is, how do you engineer that? And I think rallying around some kind of political identity, like atheism or anything else, is probably not the thing that's going to push the ball over the line. I think it may be necessary and good to do now. Obviously, I support it to some degree, and I have my own secular organization, Project Reason. But the analogy I use is and many of you have probably heard this, is to something like racism. Now, what is it that has fundamentally eroded racism in our culture? I don't think it's the Civil Rights Act. I don't think it's the NAACP. I think those are essential pieces. But I would take Chris Rock over the NAACP any day in terms of the effect on the culture, the effect on changing attitudes towards African Americans in this case. And so we have to change. We need an attitudinal change in the culture, and the only way to do that is to make sense, sort of all at once, on 1,000 sides, and to not tolerate obvious bullshit. And so it's not one answer to what you should do getting out of college, or what you should do in whatever place you're in culture. I think the burden is to make sense. The burden is to support people who make sense, read good books, write good books, have consequential conversations, ask hard questions of people who clearly don't know what they're talking about, and expose their ignorance and hypocrisy and doublethink to the world wherever you can. So, for better or worse, that's the only answer I got at the moment. According to Wikipedia, after leaving Stanford, you traveled to Asia and you studied meditation with Hindu and Buddhist teachers. Could you give some insight into this period? How significant was this time for you? Do you still practice meditation? Yeah, I do practice meditation still, and this period in my life was just absolutely formative of my view of the nature of human consciousness, what the possibilities are for changing our experience of the world. Why it would be interesting to study consciousness and subjectivity at the level of the brain. I mean, all this preceded my interest in neuroscience, and so what I did in my 20s, really, I still practice meditation, and I've done some subsequent period of intensive practice on retreat. But in my 20s, I spent about 2 years of that decade on silent meditation retreats, ranging from as short as a weekend to 3 months, and most of this was done in a a Buddhist context, studying a practice called Vipassana, which I blogged about on my blog recently, so you can read my comments there. Vipassana is a very simple practice that is just perfectly designed for export into science and the rational community generally, because there is actually nothing you need to presuppose on insufficient evidence in order to get the practice off the ground. You don't even have to like anything about Buddhism. It's just a practice of training attention on the present moment. And you start with your breath. You start with just the experience of the sensation of breathing. And as you learn to focus on that one object of attention, the first thing you realize is how difficult that is. I mean, people who have not tried to meditate tend not to realize just what a torrent of white noise there is in their mind at every moment. We're just thinking every moment of the day. We're chased out of bed by our thoughts in the morning, and we just think until we fall asleep at night. And the character of this conversation we're having with ourselves is really what engineers our suffering, or the kind of the mediocrity of our lives in every present moment. All of our worry and anxiety and self-doubt and self-criticism, and I mean, obviously thoughts are necessary, and we couldn't navigate our lives without thinking. But this automaticity of being lost in thought without knowing that you're thinking is really the string upon which all of our suffering is strung. And meditation is a tool for sort of stepping back from that process and discovering the space in consciousness prior to that stream of thinking. And there's a tremendous amount of relief that comes from that. And so at the first pass, it's a great tool of stress reduction. I mean, you begin to notice why you suffer, how you're suffering, the mechanics of suffering moment to moment. The mechanics of worry and doubt and fear and anger, etc. And meditation gives you a tool to sort of relax that automaticity. And that tool can be very hard won to get in hand. It's not easy. Again, the first thing you discover when you go sit in silence for days or weeks and try to meditate every moment of the day is just how hard that task is. Paying attention to the breath is incredibly difficult. It's simple it's a simple instruction, but it's incredibly difficult to do. But at a certain point, you can actually develop enough concentration to do it, and there's an incredible freedom that comes with that. It is a relief to be able to just put down the burden of your rumination, if only for a moment. The other thing that comes from it, and the reason why this is of such intellectual interest to me, as apart from personal interest, is that it breaks this cognitive illusion that most of us live with most of the time, that we are egos, that we are selves, that we are this something to which this pronoun I can refer, riding around inside our bodies. I mean, this is the point of view that most of you, I think, will find familiar, that you don't feel truly identical to your body. You don't feel that you are coterminous with your body down to your fingertips. You feel that you have a body. You feel that you are a subject living inside the body, which is paradoxically a kind of object. I mean, it's a kind of a vehicle for you. Most people feel located behind their eyes, kind of looking out at a world that is other than what they are. And the body is in some sense other than what they are. And this is an illusion. This is an illusion that we know this is an illusion neurologically. We know this doesn't make sense scientifically when you just reductively look at what the self could possibly be as a collection of systems. But it doesn't make sense subjectively. It's a subjective illusion that can be penetrated. It is what it feels like to be thinking every moment of the day without knowing that you're thinking. And when you can see thoughts as just objects of a kind arising in consciousness that's prior to them, this sense of self, this sense of being this locus of consciousness behind the eyes, looking out at a world that's not self, that you can break that illusion, if only for a moment. And breaking that is I think, of great utility personally, psychologically. It's also of great interest psychologically in terms of just how we understand the mind at the level of the brain and how we think of ourselves as subjective creatures. And it is also the point of contact between any complete description of the mind and everything that's really at the core of religious and mystical and spiritual literature. I mean, the fascination that human beings have had for 2,000 years, at least, with notions of self-transcendence and transforming human life in the context of religion has been seeded by this possibility. I mean, people have lost their feeling of self to a great degree, and with that loss has come incredibly positive experiences and a real freedom that is rare in this world. And then they have kind of witnessed that freedom to others and described it in terms of Iron Age pseudoscience and philosophy. So it's you have it all conflated with very ancient concepts of being in relationship to a deity, and this is a problem. I mean, the only language we have had in which to talk about the higher possibility of self-transcendence has been religious language, and that's something that I'm hoping to change in my next book and in subsequent conversations about this. I think there are more questions on the subject, so that won't be the last you've heard from me on that subject. So been several questions on meditation, and one thread I think I should pick up on here is this connection between anything we might talk about in terms of self-transcendence, words like transcendence, words like spirituality, and the notion of kind of supernatural things. I mean, is there any kind of spookiness that we must believe in or endorse in order to practice meditation or grant some legitimacy to these claims? I think we have to make a really clear distinction between describing the character of one's experience and making claims about the way the cosmos is. And this is really where a lot of conversations about really any conversation about meditation and spirituality and science tends to go astray. You have someone like Deepak Chopra, who is for all intents and purposes, a pseudoscientist and a charlatan, who makes legitimate claims about the character of the experience of meditation. I mean, it's possible to feel that you're one with the universe, I mean, to lose your sense of boundary with the universe. It's possible to have really wonderful kind of oceanic experiences of consciousness, or experiences that seem like just pure consciousness, where sense data fall away and it just seems like you are consciousness prior to anything else showing up in terms of the character of your experience. But someone like Deepak then moves from those experiences to making claims about consciousness giving birth to the universe, that we are the one mind that in which the universe is arising, metaphysical and even physical claims for which there is no warrant. And so you have to be very slow to extrapolate from what you experience in the darkness of your closed eyes to what is true of the nature of the universe. And so people have been offered a kind of false choice between pseudoscience on the one hand of the Deepakian flavor, and a kind of pseudo-spirituality or a pseudo-mysticism, because it is not true when most scientists and most atheists and secularists say, well, we're spiritual. If spiritual means I love my kids, I've experienced a beautiful sunset, I'm in awe at the beauty of nature. When Einstein says that it's a miracle that the laws of nature are rationally intelligible and they're mathematically beautiful, this whole sort of picture of awe and wonder that scientists can attest to If that's spirituality, well, then I'm spiritual too, and there's really nothing left out. There is something left out. Okay, that is not, that whole picture, as valid as that is in terms of describing the scientific impulse and rather ordinary experiences of beauty in the world, that is not what a mystic, a real mystic or contemplative experiences after his 10th year in the cave doing nothing but meditate. I mean, that is not the highest possibility of human consciousness being attested to by all of the religiously confused people over the ages who have talked about being one with the universe. There is there's a spectrum of experience that we have to acknowledge that many millions of people have experienced, that is a hell of a lot more interesting in the end and transforming of the human personality than just being in awe at the beauty of nature. So atheists deny this at their peril, because people who have had these experiences know that they're not being captured by this language of what a beautiful sunset. So my argument is that we have to avoid pseudoscience and we have to avoid pseudo-spirituality. We have to just become interested in the full spectrum of human experience and talk about it rationally. Question from Railboy. Who has offered the most level-headed and persuasive arguments against the claims you make in the moral landscape? I'm just finishing the rest of that question. Railboy has been extremely disappointed by the kind of level of criticism of it. As have I. There actually has not been an argument against the case I make in the moral landscape that I have found even momentarily destabilizing. I mean, all of the difficulties that my argument runs into, I feel like I raised in the book, and much of the criticism I've gotten has been from people who either have not read the book or have read it badly. I mean, there have been a few nits to pick, obviously, as there are with any book, but the big sort of hard swing criticism that I've gotten has been from people, for the most part, who've just missed the point somehow. And undoubtedly, some of the fault lies with me. I mean, if I were a better writer or a better communicator of these ideas, well, then I would have fewer problems. So it's one of the things you get when you write controversial books hammered into you is just how hard it is to communicate successfully with people about loaded topics. And this notion of science ultimately absorbing our talk about the good life, about values, is an incredibly scary idea for many people, and even many people who should be able to parse what I'm saying without getting emotionally hijacked. So I've just run into the full gauntlet of pushback and misunderstanding that you get when you introduce a taboo, as I did with my books on religion. So anyway, I share your disappointment, Railboy. A question about being able to reason people out of their beliefs. This is Steak Music, and it seems like there were a few more questions on this point. Whether you can ever successfully reason someone out of their beliefs when they didn't get these beliefs by reason in the first place. This is something I actually run into a lot, where people imagine that no one ever changes their mind, that it's incredibly difficult to reason with people, and it is, and yet I see the evidence of people changing their minds all the time. I've received emails by the thousands from people who were at one point fundamentalists. I mean, I've even received emails from fundamentalist ministers who have completely lost their faith, but who are still functioning as ministers because they can't figure out what else to do with their lives. I mean, it's kind of flabbergasting that anyone's in this situation, but multiple people like that actually have been interviewed by Dan Dennett now and some of his students. So you hear from people who have gone made the full tour from Bible thumping literacy to absolute certainty that they were wrong. What you don't tend to find, however, is people doing that in real time. You never really see the evidence of people changing their mind in response to counter evidence and counter argument in real time under pressure. People tend to want to change their minds in private. And I understand that because it's sort of embarrassing to admit that you were wrong. But people do change their minds, and they do it based on some kind of collision with evidence and rationality, or the evidence of other people's bad reasoning and self-deception. When you become sensitive to all the people around you living in an echo chamber of confirmation bias and shoddy reasoning and selective cherry picking of data, it's possible to wake up and see the untenability of that, and there obviously are millions of people who have. So reason is the tool. It's the tool in the toolkit to use. I think one missing piece, which I alluded to earlier on a question about spirituality, is if all you have is reason, if all you have is the talk of science and debunking of religious belief, and it's all framed in basically a denial of the character of people's experience or the legitimacy of their experience, then you have a problem, because people know they've had certain experiences. They have a admittedly fallacious set of beliefs about what those experiences mean or what they attest to, but they know they've had these experiences. And what atheists and secularists and scientists tend not to do well or at all is connect to the character of those experiences and give some alternate explanation for them, an explanation that is not entirely demeaning and deflationary and gives some warrant to the legitimacy of the experiences themselves. So an experience, for instance, like self-transcending love, experiencing love of a sort that makes no sense unless you have experienced it. So literally knowing that you could love a stranger, someone you have actually no relationship with, as your default setting. Now, people have had these experiences on MDMA, people have had these experiences in religious contexts, but there are people who have not had this experience, right? It's just a non sequitur when you talk about loving your neighbor as yourself, as Jesus is reported to have said. So if you're someone who has no idea what people are talking about in that area, and you have a lot of Christian talk about Christian love, and the only purpose toward which you can wield your reason is to say all of that is bullshit, well then it's a totally unpersuasive argument. You need more than that, and I think we can, as a community of reasonable people, marshal more than that in an effort to get people to think sanely about the nature of reality. A question about MDMA, which I have recently touched on. Let me just give a word of caution about MDMA. I haven't been shy about saying that MDMA has been useful to me personally. It was actually the first drug I took that made me realize there was a very different kind of experience a person could have in this world than the one I was tending to have, and so it was incredibly useful for me. I actually think MDMA is not the safest drug in the world. I think there's good evidence now that it's neurotoxic. It's also a drug that can clearly be abused in a way that certain classic psychedelics really can't. It's been many years since I've taken MDMA. And for issues of safety and concern for its toxicity are largely the reasons why I wouldn't take it now. So I don't want you to get the sense that I'm telling you to go forth and and roll by the millions. I think while I wouldn't say you should never take it because I took it and it was incredibly useful, I think it's issues of purity and knowing what you're getting, and even getting pharmaceutical grade MDMA is not intrinsically safe. I think that the jury is no longer out on whether this damages neurons. So, question from Zodarap, I think that's how you would say that, about Peter Singer and vegetarianism. How could one ethically defend eating meat? I think that's the gist of this question. You know, I actually can't ethically defend eating meat. I do eat meat. I was a vegetarian for 6 years and began to feel that I wasn't getting enough protein, and started eating meat again, and found that I actually felt a lot better. So I think it's hard to be an intelligent and active and fit vegetarian. At least it was hard for me. But clearly the way we treat animals, our farming practices, just the nature of what life is like in an abattoir, I can't defend any of that, and I can't defend delegating that. And I would support any effort we could make to make that whole practice much saner and more compassionate. And the moment we had a real substitute for it, the moment we had synthetic meat, say, which is actually something that people are working on, I think we would have an ethical obligation to do that. So it's not there's a lot to say about the ethics of meat eating. There's a lot to say about the ethics of farming. There may be ways to differentiate among species. You know, if pigs suffer much more than cows, well, then we should have much more concern for pigs. I don't, in fact, know that they do, but there's many questions here. But as a global issue, I think Singer is very often right on the subject. I think it's unethical to delegate something to be done that you wouldn't do yourself for ethical reasons. You know, if you would be horrified to kill an animal and couldn't just never countenance it to get your next hamburger, well then, to have it done out of sight and out of mind is not an ethical solution. Now, it's the solution that many of us still sleep reasonably soundly at night, having put in place. But I don't have an argument to support it. Questions of security and my own security, bodyguards. I hear you live in an undisclosed location, travel with bodyguards. The security issue, I don't want to oversell the security issue because I worry that people who want to make similar noises to the sort I'm making will be scared to make them because they just think there's this your life is utterly complicated by having let your reason out in public. Your life can be complicated by doing so. It's not. I take security seriously. I take it more seriously than some people who have similar job descriptions. But nothing bad has happened to me, and nothing. And I don't regret any decision I've made to have the career I've had. So it's not being a public figure to any degree entails a certain kind of security risk. I'm sure there are actors and CEOs who get much more hate mail than I get. In fact, 99% of my mail is incredibly positive, incredibly supportive. So you shouldn't imagine that the moment you criticize religion, every time you open your inbox, you are just hearing from people who hate you all day. There's some of that, but it's for the most part not at all what's going on. Nevertheless, there are a lot of crazy people out there, and I get my share of death threats, and I take the issue seriously, and I get security wherever I think it's needed. So, and there are people who have exquisite security concerns, and this is, in comparison with which I have no security concern. Someone like Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who you know is many of you know is a colleague of mine and on the advisory board of my foundation. Ayaan is someone, she's an ex-Muslim who is officially an apostate. Now that puts you in a very different category of, and the Salman Rushdie effect is what she has had to live with, and those security concerns have been obscene, and that's it's a problem. It's a problem that even in the United States, someone like herself can't go to a college campus without these incredible machinations and metal detectors for every talk, etc. So we need to put our house in order security-wise, but personally speaking, is not a fear that I live with on a day-to-day basis. So there's a question here about the USSR and I assume communism generally as a militant atheist power, and this questioner Eusebius is sort of pushing back against some of my answers to this in the past. In the past, I've said that communism was kind of like another religion. I mean, communism was a nationalistic, and you can lump these all together: communism, Stalinism, even Nazism. These are ideologies that obviously were quite dogmatic and focused not on God, but created a religion-like cult organized around economics on the one hand, or the purity of German blood on the other. And Eusebius is worried that now I am basically using religion to subsume everything that human beings do that's bad. No, the issue is dogmatism. The issue is strong conviction without evidence, and conviction that is shared by the mob, so that you can, the hatred of Jews, say, to take the Holocaust as one example. Passionate belief that moves millions to act, or to demonize the other based on bad argument and bad evidence, a willingness to accept these convictions without argument, without evidence. That's the intrinsic problem, and that's the problem that is unusually present in the context of religion, but it's not only in a religious context. So dogmatism is the thing I'm arguing against, and there are political dogmas which it's not by accident begin to take on some of the character of religions when you put them in place. So you have something like North Korea, which has many of the features of a religious cult gone berserk. I mean, you have millions of people who are starving, imagining that our food shipments are devotional offerings to the brilliance of their dear leader. This is not a circumstance where people have suffered for too much reason, or too much self-criticism, or too much skepticism. I mean, this is not, and perhaps you've heard me say this before, but there's no society I know of that has ever suffered because people have become too reasonable. And so that's the lens through which to see this. This is not, most of what I've said against religion can be said against Stalinism, for instance, or North Korea. So to say that those are the product of atheism it's another reason why this word atheism is not especially useful, because as a label, it begins to confuse people. They think that, okay, well, Stalin was an atheist, so now atheism is just as bad as religion. Well, no, we're not. The criticism against religion is not the mere advocacy of atheism as an identity. The criticism against religion is because there's no evidence for these core beliefs. Let's criticize the beliefs. Let's criticize this willingness to adopt things on bad evidence. There is another question from Kasiv about the link between morality and well-being, and again bringing it back to animals and also vegetarianism and veganism. Yeah, again, the basis of morality is, on my view, a concern for the well-being of conscious creatures. So that to the extent that any creature can suffer or be made happy or be deprived of happiness, well, then we have an ethical interest in, and ethical concerns come into play. So yes, why would it be wrong to kill pigs, and worse to kill pigs than to kill flies, say? Well, it would be wrong because pigs suffer, or can suffer, or be happy, or be deprived of happiness, and they can do those things to a much greater extent than flies can. Now, we could be wrong about that. There's no reason to think we are wrong about that, but that would be the way we should parcel our ethical concern. It's to the extent that something can suffer or be made happy. That's the extent to which it sort of enters into the moral universe. And this is why it's right to be more concerned about human beings than it is to be concerned about pigs or any other species we're aware of. I mean, this is not mere speciesism. It's not merely because we're human beings we should be more concerned about ourselves. It's because we show every sign of having a broader and deeper and richer experience than any other conscious creature we know about. If we were in the presence of conscious creatures who had, I'm happy to bite the bullet here, and I do this in the book, if we met conscious creatures who we knew had a much broader, deeper, and richer experience of the world than we had, yes, they would be more important than us. I don't see that as, some people find that as such a controversial statement that it's almost a reductio ad absurdum of my argument. If there is something that stands in relation to us the way we stand in relation to bacteria, well, then that's something that's more important than us. I mean, I don't see any other way of thinking about it. Now, there's no evidence whatsoever that beings like that exist, but if they did, we certainly shouldn't eat them. So there's a question from Legion 6226. What was the most compelling argument or reason given for religion, and has it changed your mind on specific ideas? Is that part of a longer question about the experience I've had in Q&As and debates with theists, and has there been anything that has just pushed back against my criticism of religion that has given me pause or made me worry that I'm wrong about any of this? There's certainly nothing that has come from a theist or a defender of religion that has made me think that, well, maybe I'm wrong about the core issues about what's true. I mean, I've never been in dialogue with a Christian and begun to worry that, well, maybe Jesus was born of a virgin and rose from the dead and will be coming back to earth, etc. The only argument that I find interesting that no one tends to really make at length, but it would be one that would give me pause. Is a purely pragmatic argument, which is, and I'll give you, it's what I think is probably its strongest form. When you look, for instance, at why Muslims in the United States tend to be very different from Muslims, at least to this point, have tended to be very different than Muslims in Western Europe, in the degree to which they have expressed a kind of a solidarity with extremism. And we seem to have a less of a problem of jihadism and sympathy with jihadism in the States than we have in Western Europe. You look at that specific problem, the problem of religious certitude in extremist Islam, and some of my critics could say, well, the reason why things are better in the United States is because we have this rich, diverse, respectful conversation about religion, where religion is encouraged. Nobody is obliged to be any more secular than they want to be. This is not like France, where we're criticizing religion or we're banning the veil. So there's something about just kind of celebrating everybody's craziness in the public sphere, which mitigates that craziness, and especially on the point of kind of bringing Islam into modernity. The only bridge to modernity for Islam is one in which you silence any criticism of the faith, and you just sort of encourage its most benign face. And so this is a purely pragmatic argument. This is not something that gives credence to the sanctities of Islam, or the propositional claims of Islam. Now, if that were true, I don't actually know that that's true. I suspect it's not true. There are other reasons why we have a different character to the Muslim community in the U.S. than we have in Western Europe. But if that were true, if we could look at the answers at the back of the book and discover, yes, if you criticize Islam the way I criticize it, the effect will be terrible. And if you talk about Islam and dissemble about Islam the way Karen Armstrong does, the effect will be to modulate it in a few short years, and Islam will basically be like, Methodism in the U.S. Well, then that's a pragmatic argument, and I would, that it's certainly worth, I think, on certain points, caving into it. I think that there's certainly room to elide the truth and to be a mere politician about these things. I'm not convinced that that's the case, but that's sort of the hardest thing for me to ignore. If when someone raises that forcefully to the end of telling me I shouldn't be saying what I'm saying in public. Okay, well, there's a bit of a long thread on, seems to me, questioning the coherence of thinking about well-being as a basis for morality, and some expression about how hard it is to actually know, in any case, what is going to maximize well-being, and there's a bunch of questions and comments that I'm trying to distill here, and this is something that I touch on in the moral landscape. It's true that with almost any complex question, we can't know at the end of the day what all the consequences are going to be, and the consequences can be extremely good or extremely bad in unforeseen ways, and all we can do is make our best effort to navigate in the space of possible experience based on what we think is reasonably likely to occur. So one example that I've been using that is recently in the news is you look at something like the nuclear disaster in Japan that happened this year. That you put a frame around that looks like an intrinsically bad thing, and anyone who would consciously, intentionally engineer that would be a criminal who we'd want to lock away forever. I mean, this has been a circumstance of immense human suffering, but a skeptic of consequentialism could always say, well, but look, if you take a kind of a wide enough shot of this event, who knows what its actual effects are? What if it causes us to be far more careful with nuclear materials than we would ever otherwise have been? What if it winds up saving millions of lives in the end, later in this century? What if 50 years from now we'll look back at this year as just a turning point in our wise stewardship of destructive technology? We can't know in advance that that's not going to occur. So it seems to make a mockery of this whole calculus. So you don't know, you can't know even if the worst nuclear accident in memory is bad. Therefore, you can't know if anything is good or bad in the end. Well, that kind of skepticism about not knowing the valence of various outcomes in human life, I think it's impossible to act on. I mean, we can only act on what we think is plausibly going to be good or bad. It's also very hard to argue that is even if this nuclear disaster does have all of these good secondary effects, it's very hard to argue that would be the best way to have engineered those effects. We could have all gotten around a conference table and made a sane nuclear policy with just the hypothetical casualties, without the actual suffering and death and economic destruction. So it's very hard to argue that the bad things that have good consequences are the only things that could have those good consequences. So, but my argument in the moral landscape is purpose toward having making a deeper claim and for us having a deeper foundation for our moral concern. And the claim is this: whether or not we can figure these things out, whether or not we can get answers in practice, we have to admit that there are answers in principle, because there are an infinite number of questions for which we can't get answers in practice, and yet we know there are answers in principle. And this is what science is. Science is conducted in the context of our knowing that there's a background reality that has a certain character that we don't understand, and we know that we can be right or wrong with respect to our beliefs about it, and we can't always know whether we're right or wrong. So too with the possibilities of experience. We know that the universe admits of certain experiences. We know that some of these experiences are terrible, and we know that some of them are sublimely happy. So we know that there's a spectrum. We know that navigating in this space is not entirely haphazard. We know that suffering arises based on certain psychophysical principles. In our case, it has everything to do with the structure of the human brain and what we do in this world, and how the kinds of social systems we build, and the kind of influences we engineer in human life, the kinds of cultures we have, the kinds of conversations we have with one another. So we know that it's possible for life to get really bad. Just how bad, perhaps we don't know, but we know when looking down at failed states like Congo or complete upheavals of culture like world wars. We know that these are places not worth going. And we frankly don't know how good it could get, but we know that it could get a lot better than it has for most people most of the time. And so this is a domain of right and wrong answers. This is a domain about which people can form beliefs that are clearly erroneous. So you look at a culture like, again, they're my favorite example, the Taliban. I mean, these are people who are struggling mightily, making heroic self-sacrifice to build a culture that is obviously terrible, that is terrible for everyone in it. It's terrible even for the men in it. And yet I'm continually running into intellectuals in the first world, and liberals, and even liberal women who are open-minded about the legitimacy of Taliban goals and culture, and where the strongest thing they'll say against it is, I wouldn't like it, and I wouldn't want to live there, but if that's how they want to live, or they have their values, this to my eye is a complete abdication of kind of intellectual honesty, but it's also a failure of compassion. It's a failure to actually connect with how bad and unnecessary the suffering is in those places. So I'm arguing for right and wrong answers to the question of how human beings can flourish, whether or not we can actually get those answers in any narrow frame view of any question about public policy or anything else. Okay, there's actually a question about my future research from Hermes the Messenger. What kind of questions am I asking, and wanted to know about my current and future research. We're actually planning now to do another fMRI study on belief, but in this case we're looking at why it's so difficult for people to change their minds. This actually goes back to a question I answered earlier. It seems to me a bit of a mystery that people are unable to really value and accede to counter-argument and counter-evidence in real time, even though they go away and do it in private rather often. There's this, clearly people marshal a lot of resources, emotional resources, to resist counter-arguments and counter-evidence. And liberals and conservatives do it. It's not, nobody has a monopoly on self-deception and self-serving biases. But I want to look at what mechanisms in the brain actually control our resistance to counter evidence, our defense of our cherished beliefs. And I also want to look at what it means to successfully change one's mind about on points of belief in neurophysiological terms. So those moments where you resist despite a wealth of evidence, so kind of what dogmatism looks like in real time, and those moments where you actually cave in and have your views about the world modulated successfully. That's something that we're going to do a neuroimaging study on soon, and actually my foundation, Project Reason, is going to fund that. And that, it seems to me, is a not only an interesting question, but it strikes me as the perhaps the most consequential question. I don't think that the neuroimaging component of it is necessarily the only or most consequential piece, but the most consequential phenomenon we're dealing with, I think, in human culture is the fact that we can't successfully talk to each other. We can't successfully change one another's views in anything like real time based on reasoned argument. We have these echo chambers where you have, in the political sphere, you have Democrats and Republicans in the U.S. Having conversations about all manner of things, the economy being especially consequential at this moment. And you get the sense that there's nothing that one side can say to the other, let's say on the desirability of raising or lowering taxes. You get the sense that there's nothing that they could say to the other. There's no panel of economists marshaled on either side or in between that could get the two camps to persuade one another. And there have to be right or wrong answers in this space about, in the question of what to do vis-a-vis taxes. And so I think there's something about this breakdown of self-criticism and intellectual honesty and an openness to rational argument that is, while we celebrate it in the ivory tower and in public discourse generally as this common tool we use all the time, we rely on it as this is essential, rational discourse, rational argument, this is the best of us. I think I can count on one hand the number of times in my life I've seen someone stripped of their cherished opinion in real time, under pressure, in the face of counter-argument. And so it's incredibly consequential that we don't have more humility and more openness to radical changes of opinion in the public sphere, because what then happens is a complete failure of decision-making and policy-making. So I'm going to try to get a neuroscientific handle on it probably sometime in the next 12 months. And with that, I think I want to wrap up my Reddit answer session. It's been a pleasure to talk to you guys. Thank you for the invitation. I'm sorry it took so long to get these answers to you. And again, I'd like to thank Mahalo and my friend Jason Calacanis for giving the studio time. It's made it very easy to do. Thank you very much.